Now that we have discussed about Bootstrap, what Bootstrap is, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of Bootstrap, let us now go ahead and integrate Bootstrap into our web page and see how we can leverage the different properties and the different features that Bootstrap comes with and directly import them in our web page. So let us get started with iDigitalpreneur. Now, for this purpose, I have my index.html page and my style.css, although we won't be using my style.css file, right? We'll be directly importing the Bootstrap class into our HTML page. And as we know that Bootstrap essentially is a bunch of different predefined CSS classes. And all you ever need to do if you are only using Bootstrap, you can directly import that class name into your index.html file or your HTML file, and that will kind of reflect in the final output. So for this purpose, I have my Bootstrap website open up, and Bootstrap documentation is perhaps the best place where you can actually go ahead and learn a lot about the Bootstrap. But just to have a basic example of how to integrate Bootstrap, you just go on getbootstrap.com and you scroll down and it will show you how you can read the docs and how you can download Bootstrap for our purpose, because we simply are using a simple HTML page. So we will include Bootstrap via CDN. CDN is essentially content delivery network, and it is basically a server which serves you the CSS and the JavaScript files. And if you want, you can go on the docs file here and you can quickly introduce the, and if you scroll down, you can quickly introduce the CDN files right here. So if I go back to my page, let's copy these two things, because the link will be the CSS file that Bootstrap requires. And this CSS file is a huge CSS file with all of these different classes and all of these different properties defined. So I will copy it from here, go back to my code, and I will load my link just above my style.css. Now, this is something which you always need to remember, that the sequence of your loading of CSS files is important. And ideally, you would want to load Bootstrap first. And then if you have any custom CSS files of your own, then you would want to load it after the Bootstrap. If you load it before the Bootstrap, although there won't be any errors or problems, but by any sheer chance, if there are conflicting names within your custom CSS file and the Bootstrap file, the loading sequence of the Bootstrap file after your custom CSS file will ensure that the Bootstrap CSS gets priority because of the cascading effect. So this is a rule of thumb which you can follow, is that you just load the external CSS files first, and then at the end just load your style.css, because in case you want to override some behavior of Bootstrap, you can do that in your custom style.css. So I've included my my Bootstrap CSS file here, and I would also want to include the JavaScript file. And you can see here it says that if I want to use the modal, or if I want to use some of the components which require some sort of an interaction, so for that I will require to include the JavaScript file. So I will copy it and I will paste it at the end of my body like this. So I have included both of my CSS as well as JavaScript for Bootstrap. So now I will go ahead and open my web page using live server. So once I go here, let's copy this and let's go here. And now you can see that nothing is there because I haven't included anything inside of my Bootstrap or inside of my index.html file. So let's go ahead and add something. So I will go to my documentation and let's just see what all things we can include. Now, if you scroll down, you will see a lot of different components and features and available UI components present in your Bootstrap. So we have the layouts, which allows you to create layouts, responsive layouts from Bootstrap by simply adding in classes. So let's go ahead and add in a simple container. And if you click on container, you can scroll down and it says that if you want to just add in a container, you can just copy this code here and go back to your HTML and just paste it. inside of here. So now I basically have created a responsive container, and it is as simple as that, by creating an HTML element and giving a predefined Bootstrap class name, which you can find in the documentation. So now, if let's say I want to include some responsive containers, so responsiveness is defined by SM, MD, LG, XL, and double XL. So these are basically breakpoints in your overall CSS media query. And responsive container says that if I give my container a class of container small, so the width of the container will be 100% till the point the SM specification or this SM query is reached, and then it will revert back to the max width property. So what do I mean by this is, if I go to my breakpoints, right, I will say that it is SM. So the moment the screen size reaches a size of 576 pixels, at that point of time, my container will take up 100% of the parent width. And the moment it goes well above 576 pixels, it will fall back to a fixed max width property, which is somewhere here. So let's just check. Yeah, this is the table which I was mentioning. So if I'm doing container SM, it will take up 100% of the width till it is less than 576 pixels. Once it reaches any time at 576 pixels or greater than 576 pixels, the width of the container will be 540 pixels, and that will be fixed. And once I keep on moving to larger screen sizes, you can see that the max width of that container is predefined. And all of this is following standard industry practices. This is not something of a random value. It is following some industry practices, that all of these widths are available for different screen devices, right? And let's now go ahead and look at how Bootstrap creates the layout. So you can click on grids, and basically Bootstrap works by following a 12 column system. So you can think of your entire page to be sections of 12 columns, and you basically place your elements in a span of these 12 columns. So you define the number of columns you want your element to span, and that will be the width or the size of that particular element in your web page. So if I scroll down, let's now go ahead and include some of the layouting. So I will copy this code here, which will kind of create this sort of a layout, this sort of a feature. So inside of my div container, let's copy this. And let's go back to my page, and now you can see that these divs have taken up different spaces. To kind of visualize this, let's go in my style.css, and I will say that I want the div to have a border of 1 pixel, solid gray, right? And now you can see that these divs basically are taking up different column spaces. And the moment I gave it a class of container, that is my parent container here, container of SM, you can see that my div is taking up a certain width in my viewport. It's not taking up the entire space of my viewport, rather it's taking up some space in my viewport. So now, if I take a look at how these different columns are distributed, you used to define each and every row with a class of row, and inside of each rows, you define the column. So I want the first column to be of class column, and the second class to be a class column as well. And this is now taking up equal spaces inside of my row. So every time you are creating a new line of HTML elements, you think in terms of rows and columns, pretty much the same way you think in terms of tables. So whenever you're creating a table, you create a TR first, and then inside of it, you define different TDs, which are essentially your columns. That is the same thing that goes here, that you define a class of row, and inside of it, you define a class of col. Now in my next row, you can see that I have 3 of my different columns, and each of them are taking up equal amount of space. This is because Bootstrap internally uses both flex as well as grid to kind of, it mix matches both of these things to create all of these responsive layouts which are available in Bootstrap. Now, in order to give them a different spanning, I can go ahead and give it a value by, let's say I give it a value of 3 and I give it a value of 4, and I give this a value of 5. Now, essentially what this means is each of my divs will take up different spanning spaces across the row. That is because I have informed HTML that this is a call, but it is taking up 3 columns worth of space. And that is what it's doing. It is taking up 3 columns worth of my space inside of my parent. The second one I'm mentioning that I want the number of columns of this div to take to be column of 4, and that is why you will see that this div 2 of 3 is slightly bigger than 1 of 3 because it is taking up 4 column spaces. And finally I have call 5, which is taking up 5 columns worth of spacing. So you can now think about different uh, columns inside of your bootstrap, right? And you can start placing your elements accordingly. So this is the entire grid system of bootstrap, and any layouting that you do, you think in terms of the 12 grid system which bootstrap uses. Now, if I scroll down, this was all there is to layouts. You can, of course, go ahead and create complicated columns, right? You can scroll down and you can see how flex and grid are being used to create all of these layouts. And all of this is beautifully explained inside of the documentation. But I will now go ahead, scroll down, and let's insert some predefined custom components already there. So scroll down and you will find a section of components, and you can see a huge list of different components available. So let's just add in a button. So I'll click on button, and this is basically all of the different types of button that you get, and you can see all of the colors and the hover effect and the click effect. All of that has already been defined inside of the bootstrap class. So now I can go ahead, let's just copy this entire code from here and let's paste it in one of my divs, let's say in this one. Hit on save, go back, and now you can see that all of my different buttons have been included, and all I needed to do was give it a type of button and then give it a class of some predefined bootstrap classes, which was btn. Btn is telling bootstrap that, or telling HTML that I will be using the bootstrap class of btn, and then to define the class color I used BTN primary, BTN secondary, BTN success, and all of these have a predefined color and predefined effect. So you can use all of these components. Buttons is one example. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of more complicated elements. So I'll click on modals, and let's just uh, let's just include this modal here. So I will copy this complete modal code, and this is the beauty of using documentation, that you can copy the entire code on your own, and it will kind of give you that exact element which is present. So now if you load it up, you will see that the modal is not there. That is because I actually have to link a particular button with a modal. So for this example, I will copy this code, and you'll see that this kind of opens up this sort of a modal if I click on this button, and all of this is happening just using bootstrap classes. So let's delete this. We don't require this anymore, right? And let's paste it here, or rather let's just take a look at what is happening. So inside of my div, I did this, and let's click on this, and now you can see that I have successfully created a complicated using modal just by including bootstrap classes. I did not have to write any JavaScript or any CSS. All of that has been pre-included in the bootstrap class itself. And finally, let's just see some complicated components which are available. And one of them is the progress one. If you want to have progress, or let's just do spinners. So if you ever wanted to create a loading sort of effect, all you need to do is just copy the spinner here and just go ahead and paste it any place inside of your div. And now finally, if you take a look at it, my component has been integrated. So it is as simple as copying the code and pasting it inside of your HTML page, and that bootstrap component will be injected. Now, apart from these components, there are a lot of helper classes, there are a lot of utilities, and to kind of discuss all of these utilities and helper classes would be kind of an overstatement for this course. I just wanted to put out that this is how you start integrating Bootstrap in your project. And depending on your particular use case or the use case for your project, you can go ahead and customize all of your Bootstrap. If you want to have some sort of a customization, you can take a look at the customize section of the documentation. And here you can customize different color options, different color modes. If you want a certain component to modify it in a different way, all of that information is already given here. And if you want to create your own customization, you can do that as well. Apart from that, if you want to optimize something, if you want to kind of improve the performance of your application by importing less and less CSS code, because if we take a look at what the CSS file is all about, let's just copy this URL here and paste it inside of my browser. So here you can see that this is a minified CSS form, and you can see all of these are essentially nothing but CSS classes. Now it is probably thousands and thousands of CSS classes already included inside of your CSS file. So this is again one of those disadvantages that I was talking about, that if you are integrating CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, it is definitely increasing the size of your application, because you are now injecting a lot of unused CSS classes in your code, which was simply not the case when you were using vanilla CSS or raw CSS. So if you want, you can go ahead and optimize it. You can import some less SAS imports, and you can import some less JavaScript. All of that is actually defined in the documentation itself. That is only a performance optimization, but this kind of gives an overview about how Bootstrap helps us to quickly scaffold an application by just integrating or copying the component code directly from the documentation in the web page. And if you ever want to kind of overwrite something, you can go back to your code and use your style.css to kind of write another class or another subsequent class. And if you are finding some things to be overwriting still, you can use the important aspect that we discussed, and important will kind of override any Bootstrap behavior, although that is something which is not recommended at all. If you want to do some customization, kindly do it inside of the Bootstrap modifier file itself, and all of that information will be given in the customize file here itself. But most of the times, if you're creating simple web pages, you don't actually need to go ahead and modify your Bootstrap file. Now, this kind of brings us to the end of the discussion of Bootstrap. It was rather an introductory video about Bootstrap. Again, I'm leaving a lot of things, a lot of discussions, a lot of scope about using Bootstrap in your own project, and you can just go through the documentation once to understand a little bit more details about Bootstrap and what all different things you can do whilst you're using Bootstrap in your project.